Welcome back to Profits on Purpose, the podcast for e-commerce and CPG founders who are looking to scale their businesses both profitably and purposefully. I'm your host, Nate Littlewood from Future Ready CFO, where I help seven-figure e-com and CPG founders make confident, data-backed decisions that drive profitable growth and help them sleep better at night. Anyway, Today's guest is Walid Nasserdeen, who's the founder of W.NDeen Advisory and the author of a best-selling book on business operations and strategy called Mind Your Business. He's actually got a copy of it just behind him there. Walid specialises in demand planning, forecasting, and inventory management for CPG brands doing $5 million and up in revenue. What makes his approach really unique is his ability to help founders move from reactive firefighting to proactive systems. And what I really, really love about his approach is that the frameworks and systems that he uses are grounded in real-world experience. So he's previously worked with companies like Mattel, Tropical Foods, and Pelican Cases. Walid, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you. Happy to be here.
Of course. Well, I'd love to get started just learning a little bit about you and, your background. Tell me about the career journey to date. Like, how did you come to be in the, operations and demand planning space and working with CPG brands?
Yeah, so my background is actually finance and economics. So I started off on the finance side on the analytics. So I started at Merrill Lynch. I was an analyst. And then through some like M&As, seeing turnaround project kind of stuff, just fell in love with supply chain. Started off in an ice cream company as a finance guy. And then over 6 months, basically just turned into a supply chain guy. Ended up running their operations for a few years. And then made my way over to big corporate with Mattel and Pelican. And that's where I kind of specialized into the supply and demand management, forecasting, inventory management, and that kind of stuff. And then I started my consulting practice about 2 years ago, doing the same thing.
And you published a book a little while ago, which, as I mentioned, you've got sitting over your shoulder there. I actually read that book a little while ago, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the general premise is that a lot of business owners kind of think that they know their business, but really they don't. And I guess what you try to outline in the book is some key questions and concepts that people should be asking themselves. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on what the book's about and what are those, what are some of those questions and frameworks you cover?
Yeah, so I mean, you're absolutely right. The premise is basically like in business, you have to learn to ask the right questions. It's not just about answers. It's about the questions you ask. And so I'm sure you do this with your clients. When you onboard a client, you have like a certain diagnostic test or questionnaire or something that they go through. And so these were kind of the questions that, like, as I would onboard clients, they would always say like, yes, we know this. Yes, we have this in place. And then you get like 3-4 months into the project and you realize that they either didn't have it or their assumptions were completely off. So it starts on the finance side with like cost of goods sold and things like that. And then it basically touches every kind of part of the supply chain, which is like operations, finance. And so, yeah, it's a nice little audit. And then again, it's just about the assumptions entrepreneurs tend to make about their business.
Okay. And in your experience from working with many of these brands and founders thus far, are there some common areas where people tend to be off track with this stuff? Are there some key questions that they most commonly kind of get wrong or, think they have the answers to, but really they don't?
Yeah. And so the book is premise. It's called Mind Your Business, but the subtitle is the 5 questions you think you know the answer to, but don't. And so those 5 questions are kind of those common where it's across the board, most of these companies, regardless of size, whether it's, $100,000, $200,000 startup, all the way up to like, $100 million companies. They all kind of have these blinders when it comes to certain things. And sometimes it's not that they don't know it. It just can be really outdated where they don't have that all they're always looking at it. Cost of goods sold is a big one. That's kind of where I always start. It's know your actual cost of goods sold. A lot of people either don't know it or it's outdated. Like the last time I looked at it was like 2 years ago when they did the product development,
Yeah.
and then like
Got it.
margins and things like that is usually the starting point where most people don't really have a clear grasp on it.
Okay. Gotcha. So, what are some of the common problems that founders might be experiencing immediately before or around the time that they decide to reach out to someone like you and ask for help?
Yeah, so I mean, in layman's terms, the pain point that I actually solve is when you're a CBG company, you have two kind of main risks. One is being out of stock when customers come and order product from you. And then the other one is, which they actually don't see it too much, is the excess inventory, where you have so much
Hmm.
inventory that's tying up cash. And then when you talk about CBG space, you could be talking about expiration dates. You could be talking about, I do a lot of ice cream, so cold storage. So storage is very expensive, and that kind of stuff just erodes your margins, and that just kind of eats up your cash. And so those are the two main risks
Hmm.
that I solve. And so that's why I play that kind of like 5 million and above, because that's the pain
Hmm.
point where those problems financially start to make it worth solving. It's not a little pain, it's a lot of pain.
Got it. Got it. So, would you say that when you look at the clients that approach you, would you say that there's a skew one way or the other? Is there a greater split in terms of those who have an inventory shortage versus excess inventory?
So it's usually both. The
Uh-huh.
founder will put more emphasis on the stockouts. So the way I like to say that the stockout is like a car crash and excess is like cancer. But a lot of the
Right.
founders are usually sales centric. So to them, they're buying the inventory and they think they're like, yeah, we're going to sell it. It's not a problem. So it's usually both, which is you're out of stock on your best sellers and you're excess on the stuff that isn't moving. And so one of the main
Mm.
problems is one of the questions in the book is like, what drives your business, which is just a basic 80/20 exercise. A lot of finders will treat all their SKUs kind of the same. And they don't, even on
Right.
on the supply chain and the production side of the inventory, like when they order, they just order, a bunch of SKUs at a time instead of realizing
Yeah.
like, this is our driver and this is, not really performing.
Okay, so it's not so much that they're chronically understocked on everything or overstocked on everything. I think what you're saying is that more common is you'll see brands that will have some combination of both. There'll be areas where they have too much and areas where they have, too little. So on a brand that's doing, $5 to $10 million a year, like what could this be costing them in terms of, EBITDA or profitability?
Yeah. So, I mean, on a 5 million, usually the industry average, they'll say that you're probably losing between 5 and 8% off the top line from stockouts.
Mm-hmm.
And you're
Mm-hmm.
probably eating up the margins around 30% on the excess side. So for a $5 million
Mm.
brand, I mean, we're talking over $500,000 in lost sales. And that's just like
Mm.
direct orders that you can't fulfill. That doesn't include like customer damage or someone who wanted to buy and lost, they went somewhere else and you lost future sales. So conservatively, you're looking at around 5% top line and then usually around 20 to 30% on the margins just on the excess side. And most brands will keep a lot of excess or a lot of inventory. It's not all
Yeah.
considered excess, right? There is a what we call an inventory health quiz, which is like you could be overstocked on something, but know that the item's going to move out. But then you could also be
Mm.
overstocked on something that isn't moving, and that's the damage. That's the excess part that just chews it up. Whereas you have this
Okay.
supply, and you don't have the demand to kind of push it out.
Okay. And that 30% you mentioned, that becomes apparent in the form of like financing costs, or that's due to inventory shrinkage, or what's the origin of that, margin compression that you mentioned?
The carrying cost. So something sitting in a warehouse, you're
Mm-hmm.
paying the fees over and over and over again. So the carrying cost is the biggest,
Gotcha.
biggest portion. And
Gotcha.
that's if
Gotcha.
again you could
Okay.
even move it out. A lot of times what happens is we have this thing called the 3Ds when you have excess inventory. So it's discount, donate, or destroy. And so a lot of
Right.
times there's no distribution channel. So you either got to bundle it with something else, which are basically hopefully you make cost at it, or you donate it and
Mm-hmm.
it's a pure write-off, or you destroy it, which again is just a financial exercise to clean the books.
Gotcha. Okay. So when a new client comes in and let's say they, have a typical combination of some SKUs that are overstocked and some are understocked, and they have realized that this is costing them, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Where do you start? Like what are the most common, root cause problems that you're helping these folks tackle?
A lot of it is just the lack of process around the forecasting itself. So it's
Okay.
the buying process of just being reactive. So they'll buy when they're out of stock,
Mm-hmm.
and then again, it's a lot of it is what we call like conversational forecast. So it's they went to a trade show, they spoke to somebody that said they're interested, they got excited, they put a big order in, it never manifested,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's
I
just
see.
basically putting guardrails around like how they buy and what the triggers are to do those buys. And then it's a
Okay.
cleanup exercise. So I always start off with an inventory audit, which includes things like SKU classification, 80/20 rules, what's driving the business. And then when
Yeah.
you have a forecast, you can now, based off that forecast, say, okay, well, based on our forecast, this is how much inventory we hold. I call it days of stock. So we have like
Mm-hmm.
20 days of stock or 30 days of stock. And then based on
Yeah.
the lead times, you usually with the CFO, we would decide what the acceptable days of stock is. And then
Mm-hmm.
anything under, we would consider excess and try and put a plan together. And then anything under, it would be a buy signal.
Gotcha. Okay. And do you look to implement tools and processes through software, or is this the sort of thing that people can manage without any special software? Tell me a little bit more about how how your solution or your system or your process kind of unfolds
Yeah.
once you've identified the problem and you're now looking to kind of implement, a fix to it.
Yeah. So the software side isn't really that important, to be honest. You either understand
Mm-hmm.
the math and the statistics or you don't. Like I have a statistical background, so I understand it. For someone that didn't,
Mm-hmm.
it could be useful, but they would still need to understand the basics of how supply chain works. Really, what
Mm-hmm.
it comes down to is just having the communication. A lot of times, sales isn't talking to marketing, isn't talking to operations. So the
Mm.
biggest thing I do is not just creating a forecast, but it's actually getting everybody in a room to discuss that forecast and say, okay, this is what the data is saying. I know this is the first time you've seen it, but this is what the data is
Mm-hmm.
saying. This is what the company thinks we're
Mm.
going to do. And now let's see what
Mm-hmm.
that gap looks like and have a conversation around it.
Yeah. Got it. Okay. And there's a few different kind of terminologies here that people talk about, including, demand planning, inventory management, and forecasting. Can you just talk through each of these and put some definitions and language around them? I'd also be interested in hearing your thoughts on, if there's a certain way or order that we should be, tackling these things. Does one need to happen before the other, for example?
Yeah, so forecasting is first. The way I would paint the picture is forecasting is the science, demand planning is the art, and then inventory management is the result. It's the end result of all that. And so
Okay.
forecasting is the statistics. This is what we've sold over the last 6 months. This is what we're pacing to. This is our moving average, and it's a very statistical kind of
Right.
game. And then demand planning is where you start having
Mm-hmm.
these conversations around marketing, the economics. We're changing prices. We're running this promotion. We're running this commercial. It's where you start layering in all the things that aren't in the statistical history. And so that's the demand
Mm-hmm.
planning part of it. That's usually very collaborative. That's when you're talking to the other leads, the sales lead, the marketing lead, the finance team. And then the
Yep.
inventory management is more about risk mitigation. So just because you're forecasting something, there could be, different levels of risk to this forecast. And so inventory management
Mm-hmm.
is where you're putting these buffers in place where it's like, okay, this is our forecast, but we also want to have this kind of buffer or this kind of safety stock where we think this might happen, but we're not sure. So let's, and that's where the strategy part comes around. You see it a lot with seasonal businesses and then like things like new product launches where inventory management is more important than the forecast because you don't have a lot of data. So it really depends
Mm-hmm.
on where you are with the product life cycle, but they all
Mm-hmm.
three serve their part.
Gotcha. So on the forecasting side of things, there's, a lot of levers behind that and a lot of things changing. And I'm just kind of thinking about this from a CFO perspective, which is how I normally tackle these sort of problems. But I'm often looking at things like ad spend and looking at customer acquisition cost, the split between new and recurring customers. For some of my clients, I build in, seasonality drivers, if that is a major part of the business. I would imagine, I don't really get in too much into SKU level forecasting, which I suspect you do a lot more of. But I would expect that once you do get into SKU level forecasting, you need to be thinking about, what is the historical trend of this SKU? Like, is it gaining market share as a part of our total sales, or is it shrinking? Is it a seasonal SKU? Is it something that's being, going to be put on sale or promotion? Is it discounted? Whatever. Tell me a little bit more about some of the, methods and financial math that you might use to put together these forecasts, like the models behind it.
Yeah. So one of the things I like to do, and again, my background is finance, so I understand how the CFO looks at everything. And so
Mm-hmm.
a big issue in most of these companies, and the bigger you get, the bigger the problem gets, is usually you'll have a financial forecast, and it's usually coming from either stakeholders, leadership, board of directors, or something like that. And it's usually pretty
Mm.
ambitious. And like you said, it's not at a SKU level. So there's no one that's really auditing it to see if it even makes sense from an operations side. Like, can we actually make this kind of product? Do we have the labor? Do we have the
Mm.
manufacturing? And so what happens is you
Mm-hmm.
get this very ambitious forecast, and because it's at the highest level, it's typically never really challenged. So what happens is companies
Mm.
kind of just shove it down. The sales team will just kind of
Mm-hmm.
align at the customer level to whatever, the financial forecast is. And then it gets to
Yeah.
operations, and everybody is like, okay, well, we have to make X amount of money. What are we actually producing? Are we producing A SKU, B SKU, whatever? And so one of the
Mm-hmm.
things we do on our side is we call it SKU classification, which is basically like looking at each SKU and ranking it in priority. So you have your A SKUs, your B
Mm-hmm.
SKUs, your C SKUs, your D SKUs.
Okay.
C SKUs and D SKUs are usually just an inventory management exercise. We really don't even forecast them. It's more about like min
Mm-hmm.
max, where it's like keep X amount on stock, and we hit a certain level, just buy a certain amount. And so
Right.
it's a very low maintenance kind of thing because it doesn't drive a lot of business. Some of these SKUs,
Mm-hmm.
like I have brands that I work with where they have like 30 SKUs, and let's just say they're $10 million with 30 SKUs, and 8 million comes from one SKU. And so there's no
Mm-hmm.
point in putting so much priority on 30 SKUs when you have one SKU that you really need to manage. And
Yeah.
so that A SKU is
Yeah.
really where it's like the communication, the team, and seeing where it lies. And then the question is, and this is the biggest issue that doesn't get addressed, is how do you actually have a conversation around what the product plan is in the financial forecast when there is a gap? So if I'm doing a statistical
Okay.
forecast, because what I like to do is I forecast 3 different ways independently,
Mm-hmm.
and then I see how close they are together. So I'll do a financial
Okay.
forecast level, and I'll based on the
Mm-hmm.
financial, and then I'll do an independent forecast on the SKU level, and then I'll cover it in
Mm-hmm.
dollars, roll it up, and see how close those two are. And
Yep.
if my product isn't selling at a certain sell-through rate to meet a financial forecast, someone has to have that conversation. Let's say, hey, let's
Mm-hmm.
say we're a one SKU company. Hey, based on what we're
Yep.
selling, we're pacing to 8 million. Our financial forecast is 12. Is there something going on that I don't know about, a new promotion or something that we haven't discussed that's going to bridge that gap? A lot of times it's
Mm-hmm.
not. So it's like, okay, well,
Yep.
what's the plan then? And having those
Yep.
conversations. And the problem is that the lower you go down the totem pole, usually is the less the authority the person has. So the financial forecast
Mm-hmm.
is probably coming from the C-suite, and then you got a sales forecast that's coming from like a VP or director of sales. And then by the time you get down to like the planning, is usually just a production planner or a sales analyst or something like that. And so they don't have
Right.
the
Right.
authority to really challenge. Um, so that's kind of the difficulty in it, but that's where we start off, is by actually prioritizing
Yeah.
what the SKUs are. And then a big thing that I do
Yeah.
that most companies don't do is actually give operations and understanding of what the finances look like. Because what happens is when a
Mm-hmm.
production team or a supply team sees and orders, they just see how many units they need to buy or produce. So they could have two
Mm.
orders of 10,000 units each, and they don't know that this 10,000 unit order, it might be $10 million and this one's 500,000. They just see 10,000 units,
Right.
10,000 units. So it's giving them
Yeah.
visibility
Yeah.
into like, how do you prioritize and how do you make decisions that affect the business and then
Mm.
communicate across the channels.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Interesting. So you touched on some really interesting stuff there. One point about how there's often people at like different levels within the organization and different levels of, seniority own different types of forecasts, which can make, I guess, negotiations and giving feedback difficult. You've also mentioned that there's kind of an operations perspective on this. There's maybe a sales perspective. I guess there could be a marketing perspective, and there might also be the, CFO/finance perspective on it all. Tell me a little bit about how you manage these communications. Like in a situation where we do have 3 or 4 different stakeholders, each with oversight of a different part of the business, who are all coming together with the goal of agreeing on a set of forecasts. How do you design that meeting, and what are some of the common issues that you run into when you're having those conversations?
Yeah. So one of the things I specialize in is what we call S&OP, which is sales and operations planning. And that's basically an alignment meeting between the different departments. The way I like to
Mm-hmm.
paint the picture is you have sales and marketing, and then you have finance and operations. Sales and
Mm-hmm.
marketing are always overly optimistic. So sales thinks
Mm-hmm.
everything they're doing, that every customer they spoke to is going to buy off the shelves. Marketing thinks every promotion they're going to run is going to be the next big thing. And then you have
Mm-hmm.
finance and operations, which are the conservative side. So operations like we
Yeah.
only got X amount of labor, X amount of machine time. What are we doing? And then finance is like, well, who's going to pay for this? Like, do we have POs and
Mm-hmm.
what's the reason? And so it really is just mitigating those 4 groups and understanding that they
Mm-hmm.
each have their own agenda. They each have their own kind of lens that they view the world. And then
Mm-hmm.
what are their measurables? What are their KPIs? And so the way I like to put it is like, how do you speak um, what I want to do in their language? And so a lot of times with the supply
Yeah.
chain team, they don't understand how to speak to finance. They don't know how to speak to marketing and sales. So that's something I spent
Mm.
my career learning to do. And
Mm-hmm.
then it's just understanding that, even though everybody has their own agenda and their own kind of like measurable, it's what is the common ground between them. And everybody at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
once they hit their bonus, they want to hit their sales, but they have different risks, right? Like sales doesn't necessarily care about inventory because they, at the end of
Mm-hmm.
the year, when they have a bunch of inventory, no one's going to sales and like, you're going to lose your bonus because we have inventory. They're going to be like, oh, you either hit your mark or you didn't. Right. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, sales drives a lot of the inventory buying. So it's just how do
Yeah.
you have that conversation around this is the risk to the business. And at the end of the day, if you don't have the stakeholder support, it's a hard conversation to
Mm-hmm.
have. But
Yeah.
it really is just aligning that. And then it's a trust thing. Like once someone
Yeah.
understands when you actually you're not just having a conversation, but you're like, listen, here's our sales. This is what the sales look like. This is the data. This is the gap that's missing. Let's see if we can explain
Mm-hmm.
it. But once
Mm-hmm.
everybody is not forced to just take a number and they're actually have a seat at
Yeah.
the table to have a conversation, it makes the trust more, it makes the trust better. It makes the forecast that people can align with. And then it kind of makes that conversation a little
Mm-hmm.
easier. It's never easy, but
I
it's
see.
a lot easier.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Cool. So I work with a lot of, earlier stage brands. You mentioned you kind of don't get interested until like, 5 million level. A lot of my clients are, somewhat below that. And they're not yet at the point where they have full or dedicated sales, marketing, operations people. Obviously, they have me, so they have some type of finance support. But it's very common that the founder will be wearing multiple of those hats, right? Now, founders, Love them to bits, but one of the good and also terrible things about founders is that they tend to be very optimistic, and they usually have this over optimism bias, right? They like to focus on how wonderful things are going to go and how much they're going to sell and how much they're going to scale and blah, 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 blah. I'm wondering if you have any tips or advice for founders who are in situations where they themselves are actually wearing multiple of these hats, right? They are the salesperson, they are the marketing person, and they also have operations oversight. Is there certain ways that you could kind of manage the meeting that you referenced before, or at least get the benefits of that meeting when it's the founder who's actually wearing, more than one of those hats?
Yeah, so most of my brands, it's the same thing. The founder
Hmm.
is the main person. I treat them like if they were, because most founders, and I learned this from my M&A days, is whenever we would buy a company, usually the founder
Hmm.
became head of sales, right? They made it. So I
Okay.
always just kind of look the founder as the head of sales, and so I treat them like that. A lot of it really is them never really. And this goes back to the mind your business. They've never really dug into their business. They've always been that person
Mm.
out there just like selling, selling, selling. And they've never really dug into like, what are the SKUs that are moving? What are the profit margins? How much are they actually making? What SKUs are driving the business and what aren't? How much did they actually sell last year? So
Hmm.
as I come in, my first 30 days, I do a supply chain audit where I basically look at the
Hmm.
sales data, I look how clean it is, I run a report, I do the inventory now. So as I start showing them these numbers, they start to understand, okay, like this is what's working and this is what's not. And then you have
Mm.
kind of like a framework to have that conversation where it's like you have 10 SKUs, you're buying all this inventory. That's great. But these 3 SKUs, they're not moving. These ones are. So you could spend $1 million on inventory, but instead of spending it evenly across all your SKUs, let's, place the bet on these 2 SKUs, which are really moving. And these ones are just kind
Yeah.
of like sticking up your cash. And so
Yeah.
that's really where I start, is just actually putting together the data and having, part of my job is to understand the person's business so that when I come, even as a consultant or a fractional operator, I have a seat at the table. And when I say something, they trust me. So I need to look into the
Yeah.
data and understand their business well enough where I can actually like come to them and present something. And that trust is
Yeah.
kind of like where I have to build the framework. And it's like, here's where your
Okay.
business hit. Let me show you. And now based on that, if you understand, if you see what I see, it makes it a lot easier to
Yeah.
kind of, like what's working and what's not. And it's very eye-opening.
I
The
see.
80/20 rule, I suggest to all my clients
Yeah.
is running an 80/20 rule against your inventory and your sales and even like your marketing spend. It's really eye-opening for most founders.
Yeah. Interesting. So that's, I mean, I'm familiar with the 80/20 concept, but for the benefit of those listening, can you just clarify what you mean by that and how
Yeah.
it would work in this context?
So the 80/20 rule or Pareto principle basically is like 80% of your output comes from 20% of your input. So
Yeah.
an easy explanation would be like if you had a restaurant and you had 100 items on the menu, you're probably making 80% of your revenue off of 20 of those items. The other 80 items are
Yeah.
just kind of there. So it's really defining
Hmm.
like what your best sellers are and what's making your business the most money, and then prioritizing
Mm.
those accordingly to protect the business.
Got it.
And you'll see that
Okay.
across multiple things. If you have 10 employees, most of the work will be done by 2 of the people. The other 8 just kind of like
Hmm.
flounder. If you have
Yeah.
10 customers, most of your sales will be 2 customers. The other 8 will kind of like fill in the rest. And so you'll see that
Hmm.
in every part
Hmm.
of your business. So it's a great exercise to kind of run.
Yeah. Yeah. I see. Very nice. So I want to ask, from where I sit wearing the CFO hat, I see a lot of the financial consequences of bad operations, right? It comes comes to the surface in the form of stockouts. We have excess inventory tied up. We might have too much debt as a result. There might be inventory write-offs and, inventory true ups at the end of the year that we need to do. So I'm very aware, obviously not as close to them as you, but I'm very aware when there are operational problems in a business. I'm curious what your perspective on finance is as an operations and supply chain guy. How do poor financial systems impact your job as an operations guy?
Yeah, I mean, cash flow is the lifeline of a business, right? And I think one of the things that shocks most CPG brands that are new to it is what that life cycle looks like. So I don't think they all realize that you have to pay for inventory up front. And then if you're not moving that inventory fast enough, if it's sitting in your warehouse for 3 to 6 months, that's 3 to 6 months before you get your money back on the investment you spent. And so I think it's
Mm,
understanding that kind of cash flow. And then again, it doesn't matter how efficient your operations are if you're not making the margins that you need to make. Which again, the cost of goods
mm,
sold thing is a big thing with my clients. And so the finance side is very important. There's no point in running a business if you're not making money. And then it's like, okay, now we're making money. We have good margins.
mm,
The way I put it, and it's pretty common sense, but for some reason, it executionally doesn't seem to resonate with people. Is it's supply and demand. That's what I do, supply and demand management. I view the world through supply and demand.
mm,
That's all I know. But
mhm.
demand comes first. Supply is just fulfillment of demand. So a lot of times when you're
Right.
talking about excess inventory and all this kind of stuff, it's people, the assumptions that there's this demand out there. And so they start building out
Mm,
this huge supply chain, buying inventory, doing all this kind of stuff. And they never really validated the demand, and the demand isn't there. And so it's
mhm,
going out and making sure the demand's there. And then part of that making the
mhm,
demand there is making sure that you have the right market price, that your price meets what the market wants. And then once you have that, and the demand, and the pricing and the costing and stuff like that, you know how much it costs to fulfill, go out, get the
mm.
demand, and then fulfill the demand by building out your supply side. And I feel like
Right,
most
right.
people kind of have that backwards. So it's understanding that, and that's all finance. That's every business. I have someone that I mentor who's not in the CPG space, or they're a photographer, and he's
Mm,
been stalling this to start his business. And it's like, well, what are you waiting for? He's like, well, I need, 7 grand so I can go buy a camera. And it's like, that's a supply side issue. Why don't you instead take your reputation as a
yeah,
photographer, go book a wedding that's 6 months out, get a down payment, and now you have the demand. Now you take that deposit
yeah,
and go buy your equipment, and you have, so it's demand first.
yeah, absolutely. So true. Yeah, I see that all the time with with founders, and actually spend a lot of time talking to founders about the risks and uncertainties that we have around bringing a certain product to market. And, you obviously have to source it, you have to manufacture it, you have to finance it, you have to ship it. But often the greatest risks around actually launching a thing is figuring out, as you say, like how to sell it.
Yeah.
And I have found this, putting tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars into new product line and getting all the inventory when we haven't actually validated the demand yet, and there isn't a lot of certainty that we're actually going to be able to sell this product. And I'm actually chatting with one of them at the moment about a potential new product launch, and saying, why don't we just like mock up a product listing? You've got some samples of this thing already. Let's put a page up on Shopify, verify that people actually want this product and that we can sell it. If we happen to get some orders and we don't have the inventory yet, like, it's not the end of the world. We'll either refund them or we'll send them a different product. Maybe we'll give them a free upgrade. It's not a problem. But you can do that sort of thing for hundreds or a few $1,000s, and it's so cheap and so quick. And it oftentimes addresses the biggest risks in product launch, which are very rarely about manufacturing, in my experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And it's funny because the bigger you get, the worse it gets. So at the larger companies, what
Mm,
happens is when they launch a new product, they have to have a certain financial threshold to warrant it. So they'll just kind of make up a number
hmm.
just to get it approved by the board. Right? Like, oh yeah, we got this product that's going to do 10
Oh
million.
wow.
And they never really validated it, but they just wanted to
Right,
get it approved. And then once the product's launched, they kind of wipe
right.
their hands. So they really don't really care what it did in
Huh.
post launch. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And then
Well,
when you have small
that's kind of opening
brands,
up a whole can of. Sorry.
yeah. I was gonna say, when you have smaller brands that really can't negotiate MOQ, they basically just get stuck to whatever the
Yeah.
MOQ is with the manufacturer.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, MOQs is an interesting topic. Let's chat about that. And you're quite right. A lot of brands I see, they kind of just take whatever the manufacturer offers them in terms of MOQs, and a lot of times that means they're buying tens of thousands of units that they haven't figured out how to actually sell yet. Have you seen any particularly useful, or do you use any particular strategies to try to manage MOQs and get them down, and in doing so kind of reduce the early inventory risk?
Yeah. So a lot of it is, and it depends on what stage they are, but hopefully that when they
Hmm.
come with the manufacturer, you could actually search for like manufacturers that will do small batch sizes. Like there's some that specialize in small batch kind of things. So I've
Hmm.
always recommend they find that. A lot of it is, and that's never even when we talk about comments, that's something I never thought I would have to get into because I just assumed that
Hmm.
people would know.
Yeah.
Don't, but one thing is like if you have similar products, a lot of times you can
Yeah.
convince the manufacturer to spread it across multiple SKUs. And so like if you have
Mm.
three that are kind of the same, maybe they're a different flavor profile, you could convince them instead of doing 10,000 of each to do 10,000 across the three. So
Mm.
that's usually a big one that most people never even ask is like, can we spread the MOQ across multiple SKUs?
Yeah.
And then if the margins are healthy enough, it's, economy of scale, like recognize that like you want to get to a certain point and a certain price point. But if you have the margins to pay a little bit extra and not have the inventory risk, it could be worth it. So we have pay a little more to have a
Yeah.
smaller manufacturing run.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. I find that a lot of founders, when they're thinking about ramping up and buying inventory, I'm not quite sure if this is the right way to describe it, but what I see is that people focus too much on the P&L, right? They think too much about the unit economics and, oh, I need to buy whatever, 50,000 units so I can get a better price because then my margin will be better. But in doing so, they often don't focus enough on the cash flow impact and the balance sheet impact. It's like, yes, you could save, a few bucks, or maybe you'll have 3% better gross profit margin by buying 50,000 units. But you know what? You don't actually need 50,000 units. You only need five. So we've got a gigantic amount of inventory here that you don't really need. And yes, you may have made your profitability look a little bit better down to say maybe the EBITDA level, but there's this huge cash flow and balance sheet impact to what you're doing. And that's going to come back and, bite you in the backside later on, or, further down the income statement. And I'm often coaching founders on the need to just not be so myopically focused on the P&L impact of their decisions. But there's these other two financial statements, and often they're the ones that are going to get you in trouble when things go off track.
Yeah, it's funny when you say that. The first thing I think of is I have a brother who has a big family, and he's always shopping at
Yeah.
Costco. He's like, "You should shop at Costco." I'm like, "I'm a single guy. I don't need 2 years worth of cereal, right, to save a couple dollars to
Yeah.
buy one." It's the same thing. It's like they hear 22 cents instead of 25 cents, but they don't realize that
Yeah.
22 cents, the carrying cost, the inventory, the operational cost is just it's not worth it.
Yeah.
And so again, I always
Yeah.
and this also goes to the margin thing. It's like a lot of them don't consider like things like distributor and stuff like that. So I always just like, how
Mm.
healthy is your margin? And if your margin's healthy
Mm.
enough, you're better off just paying a little bit more. And then having that
Yeah.
conversation with the co-man, which is like, as we scale up, I do want better pricing. And that's also where like forecasting and stuff comes like that, where now you're giving visibility to them so they can manage their business better. And because of that, they'll give you a
Yeah.
better price point.
Got it. Got it. Cool. So, Walid, we were talking earlier about, the systems problem versus software problem. And you mentioned that, the software is often not actually that important. How many of these businesses or your clients are you just managing with simple spreadsheets? And, how far can you actually get with Excel or a Google Sheet? And is there a specific point in time where you might need to upgrade to something more sophisticated?
I'm going to say no, but I'm going to put a caveat next to it. That I'm a master in Excel. So I've actually built
Right.
out entire warehouse systems and inventory management systems in Excel. So, and I'm
Okay.
a master of statistics. So my skill level allows me to supplement what a system might otherwise do for a normal employee.
Right.
So I'm going to put that
Yeah.
caveat behind it. But the truth is no, like unless the only time I really ever force a system for a client is
Mm.
if there's some kind of quality control, like for food, you got to do recall, and you just need a system that's able to trace ingredients to production, so that if we ever do a recall, we have that in the system.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
traceability, quality control, things like that. And then the only time I've ever used a system in my career and it was helpful is when I was at Pelican. I managed 5,000 SKUs. That level of SKU,
5,000.
yeah,
Whoa.
and so that would just crash Excel to the point where like, okay, let me get a
Yeah.
system. But then I would take out, as I mentioned, the ABC SKUs. Like I would take out all my AB SKUs and do it in Excel, and I would just use the
Mm-hmm.
system for all the dummy SKUs. Um,
Right. Right.
so I don't think so. If we're just talking about forecasting and inventory management, not really. But if you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about things like quality control, traceability, then that's where the system starts to. It's good as a
Okay.
data management system. It's not good as a
Right.
statistical, machine learning, AI, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't really
Yeah.
work like that. And even if it
Okay.
does um, work, you'll rarely find a company where the data in the history is clean enough to take advantage of the
Mm.
system. And then even then,
Mm.
the
Mm-hmm.
way these CBG brands grow, the future is so unknown when you're doing like promotions and commercials and things like that, that it's not going to be,
Yeah.
would basically have to train the machine so much to the point you might as well just do it yourself. And so I have this
Right.
problem
Right.
with a lot of my online clients with Amazon. So because
Mm-hmm.
even Amazon will have like a little forecaster for you, but even
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Amazon doesn't recognize Prime Day. So what happens is you have this huge shoot up on
Huh.
Prime Day, and now it's telling you to order a bunch of inventory, and Prime Day isn't going to happen again. And so you have to
Yeah.
recognize like these kind of caveats.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's interesting. I didn't realize that Amazon did that. So they're using the Prime Day spike in their whatever rolling 30-day average and saying, "Hey, sales are going through the moon. You
Yeah,
need to restock." But it's like, no, not unless you can have a Prime Day every week. Yeah, it's
yeah. So
crazy.
they just do like a 3 week moving average kind of thing, which is usually pretty
Okay.
good. Like that's
Hmm.
the funny thing about forecasting, especially with our businesses, sometimes, and this was the system thing, is sometimes people over engineer it. And so
Mm-hmm.
when you get into forecasting, you kind of realize that we call it the naive forecast. So naive forecast is basically just what you did last year. So the gold standard is what you did last year or some kind of
Mm-hmm.
moving average or just like add 10% or whatever across the board. Like those three,
Right.
when you go into like forecasting competitions, tend to win out over most of the most advanced stuff. Now, if I was working
Right.
for like
Right.
Tesla or SpaceX or doing engineering,
Mm-hmm.
statistical modeling and all that kind of stuff is very important. But if we're just talking about like
Mm.
how many peanuts we're going to sell next week, it's not that deep. Like, and that's where the inventory
Right.
strategy kind of like comes along.
Okay.
So yeah, the
Okay.
software, the AI, all this kind of stuff, it's overpromised and it's really unnecessary, to be honest. It just complicates things.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good to hear. It's good news, I think, because a lot of founders do have a tendency to kind of think that this is a software problem, and they
Yeah.
want to throw expensive SaaS subscriptions at it, pay 500,000, sometimes multiple thousands of dollars a month to try to solve these problems. But
Yeah. And I
good to
don't
know.
want to
It's
discount it. Like I
yeah.
will say it's kind of like the way I like to think about it is like it's like a car and a driver. So if a lot
Right.
of companies that will get systems instead of like bringing someone like me on will usually come back in like 6 months and be like, the system isn't
Yeah.
doing what we need it to do. And it's like, well, the
Mm.
system can do what you do. You just don't have anybody internally that knows how to use the system. And so what happens is you'll
Right.
see a
Right.
lot of companies that every 2 years they'll change systems because they don't think the
Yeah.
system's working. But it's not that the system isn't working. It's just the data is dirty. No one kept it up to date. Like the person managing it was taking shortcuts or whatever. Even at large companies with like where we have SAP and I pay 10,000 a month. It's like the data, no
Mm.
one's managing it. It's not clean. People are scotch
Mm-hmm.
taping
Mm-hmm.
things together. And so
Mm.
it's, if you're going to have a system, make sure you have the resources to manage that system and then recognize that the system
Yeah.
it's not a replacement, it's a multiplier. So if your operations are kind of sloppy, you're going to
Yes.
multiply the complexity with the system instead of just cleaning the system. At some point, if
Yes.
someone brought me in and we got everything dialed in, I would want to put in a system just to get time back. So now instead of spending 5 hours doing something, we have a system where we can just run a report, and so now you're spending more time on analysis than you are data cleaning. But you got to
Yeah.
get to that place first before it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Walid, this has been really interesting conversation. I mean, inventory and cost of goods sold is, as you would know better than most, one of, if not the biggest expenses for a lot of these brands. And I think there's often a temptation with founders to get distracted in marketing and widgets and fancy AI and analytics tools and whatever. But the riches are often doing doing the boring stuff, right? And getting things like operations and purchase orders, getting that right. I think that's where a lot of people gloss over, frankly, and don't spend as much time on this stuff as they should. It might not be as sexy as playing with the next, AI or marketing tool, but this is how you really build one of these businesses to profitability by, understanding this stuff and doing it well. So listen, I really appreciate you sharing all your thoughts and perspective. It's clear that you have a incredibly deep experience on this topic. And for folks who are interested in maybe, learning a bit more about you and perhaps chatting about, the possibility of working together, where should they go? Where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, W.NDeen Advisory.com is the website. Walid Nasserdeen on most social media, LinkedIn, best place.
Okay. Cool. Perfect. Well, I'm going to include all your social links in the show notes below. So if anyone wants to check that out, they'll be able to click through from there. But once again, been a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for coming on Profits and Purpose. And we'll be in touch. Thanks, man. Bye.
Thank you.